Yo, what is up, y'all? Welcome back to the Father Built podcast. This podcast is all about building up fathers in holiness, healthiness, and happiness, aiming to give fathers the tools to build their house of legacy. I'm your host, Bobby Peacock, and welcome back to the podcast. Man, it's great. Now, listen, the last episode for some reason has just been popping off. So, for y'all who have been listening to this podcast, thank you so much. Huge shout out to Jacob Dantzler for being on the podcast. Major props to him. Yeah. So, like, first, I want to put this disclaimer out there. I'm talking about some of these topics, and I want y'all to know that I'm not an expert in these topics. That's why I invite people on the podcast, such as like Jacob Dantzler or Nathan Hofer or John Setzer, because as fathers, they have an expertise. And just as men in general, they have expertise in different areas that I don't have an expertise in. And so, but like really in this podcast we're really going to break down two things that I think are so important. One is just overall like health, and then the other one is boundaries. I think listening back to the last podcast with Jacob, those were the two things that really kind of like really stuck out to me, and I'm like, man, I think we should dive more into this. And there are going to be more people on this podcast that are specifically going to talk about that health portion. And so, um, yeah, so let's jump into it. So first, like, you guys know that I start with the word. And like when I think about the Bible and I think about like, some of like even like sending back to Adam and Eve, man, first of all, Adam had to be yoked. It's same with like Moses and David and all these people that you see in the Bible. Um, like these guys had to be like jacked. And even like Daniel, there's the whole Daniel fast and what he went through and um, when it comes to the Bible. And so like it's just crazy to think like where we're at from then to like where we are at now. And like for me, like I look at what the Bible says, like in First Corinthians 6:19 through 20, it says, do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own, you were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Another great verse is 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And then, and I'll jump into these. And then Romans 12:1 says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Now, I'm going to break down the Bible verse. Like, first of all, like we have one life, we have one body. And like I said, I'm gonna be open and raw and honest with y'all. This is an area that I struggle with. It, yeah, I used to weigh 315, and then I got down to 245, and now I'm between 280 and 290, and I'm trying to get back down to 245. Um, but the Bible makes it evidently clear that that the bodies are a temple of the Holy Spirit. And so as men, if we're not taking care of our bodies, we may not be honoring God with what we are eating or what we are drinking or what we are doing with our bodies. And I think so often when we read these Bible verses that we think of, um, like famous people or like a lot of people would say, well, don't tattoo your body, or don't do this to your body, or pierce your body. And I'm like looking at it, I'm like, how many people are preaching on a Sunday that are not taking care of their body, that are overweight, that are unhealthy? Or how many people are serving in a ministry that are that way? And that's including me. Um, and it's like, especially this last part of like 1 Corinthians 6:19-20, it says, therefore honor God with your bodies. So it's not just like, because we'll say, well, that means like sexually and all this other stuff too, which is absolutely true. But that also means being consistent in working out, being consistent in um, eating healthy. And then like, so whether you, 1 Corinthians 10:31, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Let me read it again. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And I think that's important to see, like, hey, we need to eat in a way that glorifies God. We need to work out in a way that glorifies God. And then this one is like, some theologians may say this is a stretch, but bear with me. It says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in the view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship, or this is your true act of worship. Now, in the Old Testament, when it comes to this specific verse, the Old Testament talked about how God wanted our best, right? Like they used to do sacrifices in the Old Testament, and God wanted the best of those sacrifices, right? What if we applied that kind of thinking and that kind of mindset to our body of like, yo, like, okay, I'm offering my body to the Lord as a living sacrifice that is holy and pleasing. But if I'm not taking care of my body, is that giving God my best fruit? Or is that just like saying, hey, God, here's, like, let's take me personally. Hey, God, here's 315 pounds of me, and this is my sacrifice to you? Or is it like, nah, God, like, here's 245 pounds of me that's yoked, that is like taken care of, and that is honoring to you. This is my sacrifice. Because the more that we can work on ourselves and on our bodies and watch what we eat, the more that we can do ministry, the more that we can honor God. And I know this may be a touchy subject for people, and I'm not trying to judge anybody, because first of all, look at me, but this is something that's important to talk about. I was doing some research on this, and I'm going to mention a reel that I listened to as well. But the CDC, talking about obesity rates. So in the 1960s, the obesity rates were at 13%. 13%. Let's fast forward to today. Are y'all ready? Today, the obesity rates are at a whopping 43% among adults. That is almost hitting, that's 7% away from 50. So that's basically saying like every 1 in 2 people that you see, one of them is going to be overweight or obese. And I know, like, there's the whole thought process with obesity. People aren't taking in bone structure, because like even me at 245, I would be classified as obese. And so, but even like I have a big bone structure. I'm just a dense dude, big dude. And um, I'm taking that into consideration when I'm saying this. But the reality is that it went from 13% to 43%, which is huge. That is a huge number. And that's a number that shouldn't be taken lightly. And so I look at myself and I look at my journey and I look at something that Jacob said in the last podcast where he was talking about consistency and the importance of consistency, and how there were seasons of his life where he would go to the gym for 3 months and then stop going and then go back to the gym and get back into it. And in this area, I think community is huge. And for the fathers that are out there that are listening to this, you have to understand, what are you living for? There's this quote that I will never forget. I read it last year. I don't know who said it. But it's just a completely powerful quote, and it changed my mindset. There's a lot of fathers out there that say that they will die for their kids. There's a lot of men out there that say that they will die for their friends and family. To die for someone, that's pretty, yeah, it can be difficult, but for me, it's no question I will take a bullet for my son. But the question that we should really be asking is, what does it mean to live for our kids? What does it mean to live for our family? What does it mean to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice that's holy and pleasing to God? It's easy for us to say we can die for somebody, but what does it mean to live? And I was listening to this. This is where I'm going to bring up the reel. I was listening to this reel recently, and it was talking about how it was talking about food, and how that is like one of those, like, I would like to call it like an underground sin that we don't really talk about, but yet the devil uses it, specifically in America, because the devil can get you food. And it's easy to eat whatever you want to eat. Like, don't get me wrong, listen, you give me a plate of soul food, I'm done. Fried food, I'm done. Right? Like, that's what my body wants. But then it's also a mind of like, you know what? How often have I let the enemy take control of this and dictate what I eat? And I know I'm being like super spiritual in this podcast, but I believe there is a spiritualness, or spiritualness to eating and to healthiness. And like, for me, it's a matter of switching the mindset. For me, it's a matter of saying, you know what? How can I switch the mindset in my brain and say, okay, I don't want to eat vegetables or fruit, and I'd rather eat this yummy fried chicken or whatever over here, and switch the mindset and say, okay, you know what? I'm going to look at food for fuel instead of taste. Like, this food is going to fill me up and fuel me up, versus, oh, this food tastes good, but it's not going to do anything for me. It's like putting gas in a diesel car or diesel in a gas car. It just doesn't make sense. For me, it doesn't make sense for me to eat fast food. Even though, yes, fast food tastes really, really good, but what is that going to do to my body? What are all those preservatives going to do and those chemicals going to do to my body? And so for me, it's understanding that, but then also understanding like, okay, if I want to live longer, I need to eat the right food, because I guarantee something that I thought about is I guarantee if we saw what we ate and if we saw what it did to our insides, like I feel like we would eat differently, because there's a lot of, even like there's skinny people that are out there that are like, man, they're on the verge of a heart attack even though they're skinny because of all the nasty food that they eaten. And I'm not trying to sound all judgmental. That's not the heart. But once again, as men, as fathers, we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And so for me, part of my higher standard that I'm holding myself to is like, okay, I eat one cheat meal a week. And I even doing that cheat meal, I'm not going overboard on it. But then also, it's like watching what I eat. And for me, it's like that's how I've been able to lose weight, is watching what I eat and getting in that rhythm and finding things that work for me. And also doing the research. Like I have a heart condition, so thus far I can't have caffeine, or like high sugary drinks. It's been 4 years without caffeine, 3 years without pop. I don't drink very often, and now it's like, okay, I don't eat candy, but I do eat like sugary stuff. Like I like peanut butter. There's these peanut butter bar things that are so good, like Special K bars or whatever. That peanut butter on 'em. Oh my goodness, that's my weakness. Like I'm on one right now just talking about it. But it's like, okay, so maybe like next year I'm going to give up uh just like sugar, like little Debbie snacks and stuff like that. Those are my weakness. And it's like every year I try to give up something. Um and so it's kind of like walking into that and and just saying that, like, okay, I need to give up something in order to offer my body as a presentable, a holy sacrifice that is pleasing to the Lord. Yeah. And the other thing too is like understanding, like, okay, so what does it mean to, like I said, what does it mean to live for our kids? But also acknowledge that our kids are watching. They're watching what we're eating. They're watching, like, if we're working out, or they can see the results of that. And um, there's been many of reels that I've seen of, like, you know, fathers that are out there that was like, man, listen, I am not working out for myself, but I'm working out so that I can continue to kick my kids' butt in any sport or to keep up with them. And that's so true. Like, I think about my son and he wants to play soccer. And it's like, okay, if I can't run and I can't do those things and keep up with him because he's getting faster, what am I doing? And so to be in that mindset of like, man, I want to keep up with my kids. I want to kick my kid's butt until he's 30. Then he can start learning how to kick my butt. And that's the dream. That's the goal, you know. But it all starts now, whether you're a young father or maybe it's a little too late. And there's some fathers that are out there that it is too late and they're regretting that. You know, this brings me down to this quote by Dave Ramsey. It says, live like no one else now, so later you can live like no one else." And he mainly says that like in the finance world, but what about the world of fatherhood when it comes to health? You have your homies that are always going out to eat and eating unhealthy versus saying, you know what, I'm gonna sacrifice the taste so that I can have the fuel for my body to grow, and so that I can live longer. So when I'm in my 60s or when I'm in my 50s, my friends are all dealing with back pain and this and that, and I'm good. I'm so good. And so for me, like when it comes to health, that's where I want to be. And I have a long journey, especially as I'm getting older. I'm realizing that, like, man, I am not, and I was saying this at 31, I am not 23 anymore. I'm not 21 anymore. I remember I was walking outside a friend's house, and they had uh, like a ice thing hanging down from their garage, and like 21-year-old me would have been like, I mean, one, it was dangerous because it was like really sharp. 21-year-old would have been like, I'm gonna jump and I'm gonna knock that thing down. 31-year-old me was like, wait, hold on, step back, assess the situation. Yes, that's dangerous. If I jump up and I come back down, I could slip and break something. So I got a shovel and knocked it down. But I'm just saying that as an example because, like, I'm not as young as I used to be. And so for me, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, I need to start taking care of my body. I don't have to look like super yoked, but also I want to do it for health. Excuse me. I want to do it for health purposes. And so, like, when it comes to eating, when it comes to the gym, um, like, find ways to get in there. Like Jacob talked about community. Find a community. But even before you find a community, you have to make it a priority. Like, you have to recognize, oh, this is something that I want to do. This is something that I need to do. So, like, first thing that you need to do is that you need to make it a priority. And you can't come up with any excuses anymore. You just have to make it a priority. And as I'm saying this to y'all, I'm saying this to myself. Now, the second thing is accountability, right? So, part of that is once you have that accountability, actually, I take that back. The second thing is community. Find community that can be there, whether it's finding a buddy that can go to the gym, because once you have that community, then the accountability will come. And then the last thing is just staying consistent and reworking your brain to be like, this needs to be consistent. And like a good friend of mine, who is has done bodybuilding competitions, he just said it's a daily life, it's a daily rhythm. Because once you hit that, first you make it a priority, then you find community. Within that community, you find accountability, and then you make it consistent. Well, once it becomes consistent, it becomes part of your life. You live, you breathe, you eat it. And it's the same with food. Like for me, I'm trying to figure out what's the best, um, like the best way for me to eat. How am I going to eat? What's the healthiest way for me to eat food, or what's the healthiest food for me to eat? Um, and like I'm in this experimental stage where I'm like meal prepping, but then I'm also like, okay, I don't like meal prepping, and so I'm looking at, where people deliver the meals for you or whatever, um, or like a meal subscription, kind of thing. It costs a little bit more, but it's one of those things. And also, like, by making it a priority, you have to recognize that this is an investment. This is a financial investment into you, but then also it's an investment into your life as well. And so that's what I would say. So first you have to, let's go through it again. First, make it a priority. Once it's a priority, be willing to invest, to find a community, like people that you can go to the gym with, because within that community, you'll find accountability, which is three, and find good accountability partners. Um, and then four is make it consistent, because once you make it consistent, it becomes a rhythm. Once it becomes a rhythm, it becomes a daily lifestyle for you. And those are all things that I am working on. I am not the perfect human being. I got a long ways to go, y'all. And so when I'm saying this is stuff that I'm learning, this is stuff that I'm walking through, and something that I've been thinking about is like, what would it look like in August to have a built challenge, a father built challenge, where I get a group of fathers and we're just all like, okay, hey, we're going to hold each other accountable to going to the gym and eating healthy, getting financially better. And so that's something that I'm exploring. If you would be interested in something um like that, like, please let me know. Like, I think I will work with a homie who has, shout out to Dad Nation Co, who has gone through this journey, and say, okay, hey, between your podcast, between your Instagram, between mine, how can we come up with some kind of challenge um, to give fathers? And so, um, yeah. So let's jump into the boundaries stuff. When Jacob was talking, he was really talking about, with his entrepreneurship and working out, and then the family time. I feel as men, sometimes we can get our hands into a lot of things. Like, I was just in a conversation today, um and I was telling the person, they were telling me, they're like, yeah, I used to have 4 jobs. I'm like, yeah, that's what I do right now. And they're like, how do you manage? And I'm like, it's crazy. I mean, because I have a full-time job. Well, first, I'm a father, I have a full-time job, I work for my friend's sneaker store, and then now I have this podcast as well. And so it's just figuring out managing time, but I can't. And I think I said this in a last podcast, but like right now I'm juggling 4 things. So thus far I'm a clown or whatever, but like realistically, I need to juggle 3 things, um, and have 3 things on my plate and do those 3 things really well. Um, and so I'm trying to figure out what that looks like for me, um, and being consistent in those things. But I can manage what I'm doing right now, and I feel like I've been managing really well. It's just like some things go to the wayside, like trying to figure out the date. It's hard. um, but boundaries, going back to boundaries. Boundaries are important. I think there's a lot of fathers, like I said, they dip their hands into a lot of things and they don't have appropriate boundaries, and then they become yes men, um, and then their families sacrifice because they're afraid to let down people. And that's the same for me. I've been there where I was a yes man. I was trying not to let down people because I was afraid of one, either getting fired or doing this. And even in ministry, like sometimes in ministry, you're a workhorse. And I have that workhorse mentality. I've had it since I was young, um, where I was, being at school, doing school. I was on our worship team. I was playing sports. And then I was involved in our art. That's probably where the 4 thing comes from, where I'm always doing 4 things, because I was in high school, so doing homework. I was playing sports. I was on a worship team, or technically multiple worship teams. And then I was also part of our kids ministry. So I was juggling 4 things since high school. So now in my mind, as I'm speaking this out, it's starting to make sense to me. Um, and so I was always doing stuff. But at some point, one of those things was starting to drop. And I remember when I was in high school, my foster mom, she had a call the church and say, hey, he's doing too much in the church. We have to cut it off because he won't. Thus for so that he can work on his schoolwork, because I was giving a lot to the church. And so for the fathers out there and for the people out there, yes, the grind is real. It is so real. But you have to learn how to manage your time effectively. You have to learn how to put boundaries in so that the things that make the most priority will come first. Like my dream right now in my life is by the time that my son's in high school, that I will be able to step back from a lot of different things and I can just hang with my son. I can build with my son. I can, like, the goal is realistically to retire, and I have a long, long ways to go. And so for me, I'm just at this place where that's where I want to be. And so, yes, I'm grinding and I'm doing these things, but I also understand that my son is very much the priority. Even though right now he's in his mama boy stage, where I even think about, like his mom called me this week and she's like, hey, are you able to pick up your son from daycare because we can't. And that time I was not able to. But I was trying to figure out in my mind, like, how can I pick up my son? And then in the back of my mind, I'm like, man, if I was retired and I didn't have to work and I busted my butt, so that I can retire and figure out passive income and this and that, I would be able to make my son a priority and be able to help out his mom, my ex-wife, to pick up my son. And so for me, it's setting healthy boundaries. And I feel like, because like Jacob talked about how, like, hey, when he's working out, he's working out. The only text that he's going to do or to answer is like his girlfriend, or if there's emergency kind of thing. When he's coaching, he's coaching. And then when he's at home, he's at home. But how many fathers are out there, me included, that let their work life enter their home life? Not just via phone or via computer or via email, but also via feelings or emotions or stress. When's the last time you went home from work and you left work at work instead of brought work home? Which is hard to do. It is very hard to do because I've been there. But I know, like, for me, when I was talking to a friend about boundaries, every Monday and Tuesday when I have my son, I try not to have anybody compete with that time. Are there occasions where, yes, it's like I need to go to a gig and bring my son, but I'm making an activity where it's like, hey, we can go to work with dad. We're going to, here's a little camera for you to shoot photos of or videos of, or like sometimes after work weekends, and it's the same thing. And so that's just the reality for me. And sometimes that happens. But when that happens, it's asking the question, like, how often is this happening? And then what boundaries am I willing to put in place so that it doesn't continue happening? And so I have like 5 tools for you that I've kind of wrote down when it comes to setting boundaries. And this is in all aspects of your life. You can use this for work. You can use this for relationships. You can use this for basically everything. So, like, obviously the first is you got to identify, like, what are your boundaries. So, like, you got to know your limits. Like, if you haven't written them down, like, take a piece of paper, write it down, put it somewhere where you can see it, Know your limits. The second thing is that you have to learn to be consistent within your limits. So so first it's like know your limits. Like basically like you're on a bridge, right? And basically you're dictating the guardrails, the safety rails. Like you're going to operate within this. This is the speed that you're going to operate. This is a vehicle that you're operating on this bridge. Here are your guardrails to not only protect you, but also to protect others. That's why you need to know your limits. But then learn consistency. So like you're on a street, the consistency is the speed limit, right? You're setting that. You're setting like, okay, I'm going to stay consistent within these boundaries. Like I'm not going to speed up or slow down. I'm going to stay at this speed. And then third is you got to communicate. You got to communicate your limits. You got to communicate your boundaries to others. You're at work and it's 5 o'clock, and your kids want you home at 5:15, and the boss says, "Yo, like I need you to stay and finish this." You have to say, "Hey, listen, this is going to have to wait until my kids and my wife go to bed." Or this is going to have to wait because your sense of urgency is not my emergency. I've worked my time. I've done my time. I need to go home to my family because they are my number one priority. Because by knowing your boundaries, you are understanding your priority. By knowing your boundaries, you can communicate your priorities to people. And then 4 is learn to say no. And this is an area that I struggle in, is learning to say no because of FOMO, fear of missing out, FOMO, and all of these things of that I want to do or that I'm going to miss out, or even like people pleasing. Like when I was in my early 20s, I was a people pleaser. And now I'm just like, okay, I don't have to please nobody. That's not my role. Like I have to work for people, yes, and I have to do these things, but I need to stay in my lane. And part of staying in my lane is understanding my boundaries and saying no so that I can do things um and make those things a priority that need to be a priority. Now, don't get me wrong, like I'm not saying that like slack off at work or um like do things that are going to frustrate your boss or whatever, but it's also building a culture within the family dynamics of saying, you know what, yes, I work my butt off at work, but when work is done, I am done. And saying I'm putting my family first. By putting them first, yes, it requires me to work and it requires me to grind, but from this time to this time I am grinding. From this time to this time, I am with my family. From this time to this time, I'm working on me. And from this time to this time, I am sleeping and I am resting. And it's setting those things up. It's setting that schedule up so that you can be consistent. Because I even think about like for me, um, like there's gonna be a transition of like right now my son is my number one priority. But when I get married, my son will no longer be my number one priority. My wife will be. And then he will be my secondary priority. Because so often, even in relationships, we put our kids above our spouse. And I was in a marriage that was like that. And it was hard. And so now if I get married again, it's gonna be like, yo, son, I love you. And this is my time with you. And this is our time with you. But at this time, this is gonna be me and my wife's time. And that's gonna be uninterrupted. And the hard thing, the easy thing is I have my son 50% of the time. So my wife will have to understand like, hey, this is my time, our time with our son. These days we're investing everything into our son. But these days, listen, these days are for me and you, baby. This is where we get it. This is where I get to pour into you, you get to pour into me, and we get to do some hot dates and all this other stuff. Completely digressing. But by learning to say no, you're setting yourself up for a healthiness, because you're putting you first. You're assessing the situation, you're reading the situation, and you're saying, can I say no, instead of just saying yes right off the bat. And the fifth thing is communicate clearly. No, that doesn't mean just communicate to others clearly, because like when we think about communicate clearly, we think about like, I need to communicate this clearly to this person. I need to communicate this clearly to my wife, to my kids, to my work, to my friends, right? Which that's important. Communicate clearly to them. Absolutely. But you also need to communicate clearly to yourself as well. Like, you have to learn to communicate clearly to yourself. And whether it's writing it down, journaling it, putting it on a mirror where you can see it daily, of like, okay, these are my boundaries. But then you also have to allow for a season of trial and error. Like in the last episode, Jacob was talking about the feedback loop, right? Like trial and error. Like, you have to give your grace to fail. But then also you have to make sure that you stand back up and say, okay, like, I gotta stick to my boundaries. And so, like, when it comes to the boundaries, I'm just gonna read these off again one more time. 1, know your limits. 2, learn to be consistent within those limits or within those boundaries. Communicate your boundaries. Learn to say no. And then, communicate clearly to others. So, like, and not only to others, but communicate clearly to yourselves. I just realized that like 3 and 4 or 3 and 5 are basically the same, but one is communicating clearly, like to others, but one is communicating clearly to yourself. And so, yeah, hopefully y'all got something out of this podcast. Yeah. And it's one of those things where, like, man, this podcast has been amazing. Like, I am learning so much. Like, people, like, when you look at like doing a podcast, it's like, I invest time into this, and it's been fun. It's been a really growing season for me, because it's like, I get to do research, I get to learn, and I get to grow with the people, with the guests that I have. And so I'm going to give you guys a little bit of insight into the next podcast before I end this one, because it's already been recorded. The next podcast towards the end may trigger some people with the topic. And there's certain things that are said on that podcast that are may go in the political direction, or like more of a political conversation, but it's important. And so this is kind of just like a disclaimer of like, hey, if you get triggered easily, just know that like there's some triggers in that podcast for y'all to listen to. And so just know that. Also know I'm not perfect. And I'm not a theologian as either, but it's crazy because like the Bible talks about be ready for an answer in every season, or be ready to give an answer in every season. And that's me paraphrasing the Bible verse. And so, yeah, if you guys have any questions, like once you listen to that podcast, please let me know. And yeah, it's going to be good. Like, I'm excited for that podcast. I was debating if I cut that part out or do I leave it in. And I was just like, you know what? We're just going to leave it in and we'll deal with the consequences if they come. And it's going to be great. And so I hope that you guys learned something from this podcast. And listen, if you're watching this like on YouTube, like, man, like, let's get the comment section going. If you are, you know, listening to some of the short form content on Instagram, like it would help a lot if you leave like some kind of like review or something, help a brother out. If you're getting value from this, like, man, let me know. And like those of you who are listening, like I see, people out in the community are like, yo, your podcast is dope, and I appreciate that. Like, and it means a lot. And so I just want to say thank you for listening and watching and learning to grow with me as we do this podcast thing together. And so I'm excited to see what the future holds. Um, and yeah, let's get after fatherhood. Let's get after masculinity and manhood, and let's strive to be better. And like I said, let me know if y'all would be interested in some kind of challenge. Um, I think that would be dope. Like to do like a father built challenge. I could team up with another Instagram page that I follow. That I know the guy from Canada, Dad Nation Co. He's a beast, and he has a podcast as well. So if you have time to listen to his podcast, it's pretty cool. I'll give him a shout out on my Instagram page. And speaking of Instagram, you guys are probably like, oh, come on, Bobby. But feel free to follow me at DJ_Peacock or Father Built on Instagram. Same with TikTok. It's just DJ_Peacock. And then if you want to follow me on Facebook, it's just Bobby Lloyd Peacock. So, excuse me. Well, thanks for listening. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this episode now. So, thank you y'all. Let's try that again. Thank y'all for tuning in to the Father Built podcast, where we build up fathers in holiness, healthiness, and happiness while aiming to give these fathers the tools to build their house of legacy. I'm your host, Bobby Peacock. Thank you so much for watching or listening. And always remember, like Lion King, remember, peace, love, blessings. We out.